Hey, Mr. Usher here, doing another recorded lesson for you guys. This one is actually going to be for the half credit class. I've been a little behind on these, but the full credit class will not be needing them for a little while, just because there have been days related to the tests and I haven't had standard lessons. Anyway, so this is going to be covering the dates of April 26th and April 27th. So it's going to be April 26th. In this case for, double check those dates there. So April 26th for the 8th period and April 27th for the 5th period. So if you're not one of those two, you're in the wrong video. Please look elsewhere. Anyway, the topic for this one was basically conformity and conflict. So conformity and conflict, basically we had a lesson that looked at these two topics in social psychology. One is conformity, and one is conflict, right? So basically, why do people conform to the groups that they're in, and why do different groups engage in conflict, right? So basic illustration for group conflict can be found with a pretty simple example here. I can get it to open for me. This is something known as the Ash line test, conducted by a psychologist named Solomon Asch. Very simple question here. You're going to see 4 lines. One line is known as the target line. The 3 other lines are in reference to the target line. So we look at this, right? Pretty basic example right here. If I can get it to show up. There we go. So here we have the target line here, and we have 3 other lines here, line A, B, and C. And Ash asked the participants a pretty simple question. Which of the 3 lines, A, B, or C, is the same length as the target line? Now, you probably already have a pretty clear idea of which is which here. It should be fairly obvious, actually, if you're looking at it closely. What happened, though, in the experiment, right, is you had the participant kind of come in and give their answer, pretty straightforward. But then you also had the participant in a room with a bunch of other participants that gave answers as well. But they all kind of gave a surprising answer. They said, oh, it's line A, right? So one person says it's line A, and the participant thinks to themselves, like, what, is this guy dumb? Like, clearly line A is shorter. Like, the correct line has to be line C. Line C is the same length, right? So one person says it's line A. They kind of write them off as being unusual. But then 2 do it, and then 4, and then 8. Pretty soon, there's several people who have said, no, line A is the same length. And after a while, what happens is that conformity begins. Essentially, all these people have said, like, oh, it's line A, it's line A, it's line A. And the participant eventually thinks, well, I guess it's line A. It's got to be line A, right? And that's the thing here. This thing is rigged to some extent, which is something that happens a lot in psychology experiments. We can do this as long as we have what we call a debriefing period, which is essentially where after the experiment is all complete, we sit everybody down and we say, hey, look, this is what was going on. And this is, in fact, what was going on, for the most part. You had, as they say in this picture, stooges, right? The actual term in psychology is confederates. We call these people confederates, and confederates are basically actors, right? So these people here in yellow, blue, red, green, and then yellow again are confederates, to use the technical terminology, whereas the guy in dark blue here is an actual participant. They were actually recording the responses and getting data from this person. So the Confederates were used to be fake participants, basically, and they essentially encouraged conformity in most participants, right? Not all of them, but most of them, right? Anyway, so this is basically an example of conformity. It's something that happens because we don't want to be seen as the outsider. We don't want to be seen as going against the curve. We develop some sense of personal identity and personal worth from feeling like we're part of a group, a member of a group, right? And so going against that can feel uncomfortable to many of us. Anyway, to get back here, The other two parts here mostly focused on the elements of group conflict, right? So I showed you this video here, which you should take a look at, about a famous experiment called the Robbers Cave experiment. Now this experiment has nothing to do with robbery or caves, really. It's called the Robbers Cave experiment, essentially just because you have a experiment going on at a camp called Robbers Cave State Park. And basically, as you'll see in the video, this camp had these two different groups of children that were pitted into two different groups. They were just kind of made up, and they were kind of pitted against each other by the counselors, right? And even though the groups were just made up, they just had a name attached to them and basically nothing else. Conflicts got very, very intense very, very quickly. Now, the video points out some criticisms that have kind of come out since this experiment was done, but it does very basically illustrate what's known as the minimal groups paradigm. The minimal groups paradigm is basically an approach to understanding group conflict that suggests that really all the people need is a basic understanding that this is our group and that is their group, and that alone can, over time, just create conflict, right? So there doesn't necessarily need to be some kind of great historical reason that groups are in conflict or some type of ideological divide. It can really just be these minimal groups, as the name suggests, these groups that are essentially groups only because somebody said this group is different than that group, and that's it, right? So yeah, check that video out, see what you think about it. There's also this presentation I did about reducing conflict because, of course, ideally we want to reduce conflict and not just, understand why it happens to begin with. Excuse me. So, basically, with this guy, we had a couple of things that we went over here. We talked about root cause analysis, right? RCA for short. Basically, as the name suggests, it's looking at the root of the problem, the origin of the problem, where the problem originally comes from, and trying to solve the problem in that way. We can apply this to lots of things, both inside and outside of psychology, but it's very useful for trying to understand group conflict in particular. I did this example that I'm not really going to go into detail on something called factor analysis, which is a big thing in psychology, particularly in social psychology. If you're trying to understand something really complex, in this case, libertarianism, this political ideology of libertarianism, which is kind of an in-between between being conservative and being liberal. So they're trying to understand why this is, and they kind of look at a bunch of different factors and try to test the strengths between these different factors, ultimately to get to a root here. And to make a long story much shorter here, this particular factor analysis suggests that people are libertarians basically because of something called psychological reactants, which basically just means that, yeah, people are libertarians because when somebody tells them to do something, their immediate reaction is, no, I'm not going to do that, regardless of what they're being told to do, right? Which, if you think about it, is probably not the smartest thing, right? If somebody says, like, hey, don't go into that house, it's on fire, ignoring that deliberately is probably not a good idea. Anyway, so some basic solutions that hopefully try to get at this and try to actually address group conflict. One is the contact hypothesis. This assumes that the root of the issue is just that the two groups only have kind of indirect knowledge of each other. They have like superficial knowledge of each other, and so the conflict isn't really about actual individual people, but about the different groups' perceptions of one another. The assumption is that these different groups have false perceptions of one another. Maybe that, African-American people have false impressions of white people, and white people have false impressions of African-American people. And this is certainly true to some extent. Evidence, though, is kind of mixed as to whether or not this particular solution, known as the contact hypothesis, actually works. The contact hypothesis basically just says that, yeah, if you get a bunch of individuals from these groups to meet together in kind of a neutral setting and just kind of hang out, then over time that will essentially cause the conflict to dissolve, right? Now, some evidence suggests this is true, right? It can reduce things like anti-black sentiments or anti-Islamic views, according to these pieces of evidence. But these other researchers here, Bertrand and Dufflo, suggest that a lot of this is self-selecting, right? So, for instance, in this particular study with teachers who spent some time teaching abroad in Muslim-majority countries, the authors from this study here, this 2017 study, point out that in that 2011 study, the teachers basically self-selected. So they said, like, oh yeah, like I guess I'd be okay with going over there and teaching kids who happen to be Muslim. And so yeah, even though their views against Muslims improved after having taught there, the authors here point out that, like, well, yeah, but the fact that they were willing to go to those countries to begin with suggests they already were at least somewhat tolerant, right? Somebody who is like a very intense Islamophobe probably would never do that, right? Anyway, other ideas kind of focused on what we call superordinate goals or superordinate threats, right? Superordinate goals or superordinate identities. There's the shared threat approach here, which suggests that if essentially two different groups have a higher or superordinate common enemy, then they essentially will set aside their differences and work to solve the particular goal. This is an example from the movie The Watchmen, in which this guy, who is kind of a hero, kind of a villain, it's complicated. Basically, he creates a fake alien invasion to get the United States and the Soviet Union to stop fighting and to work together. And even though he kills millions of people, it works, right? Not that I'm suggesting this. Please do not do that or anything approaching it. But basically, his idea here is like, oh yeah, if I manufacture a conflict for these groups that can only be solved together, then that will get them to stop fighting. Now, what we can do instead is maybe encourage people to focus on a problem that actually is already in existence and that we probably need group effort to solve, such as climate change, right? The world is getting warmer and warmer, mostly due to human activity. Can any one country solve it? Probably not. So we have things like, say, the Paris Climate Accords that can help us to address that issue. Anyway, that's the shared threat approach. There's also the shared attributes approach. So I have this very, very, very funny meme here where I compare 2002 Spider-Man to 1960 Spider-Man to Willem Dafoe, and I'm sure some people will find that amusing because Spider-Man movie. Basically, the idea here is focusing on common characteristics or values of groups, saying that, we're not so different, you and I. This is focusing on a superordinate identity, right? So if we say compare Christians and Muslims, for example, they have this superordinate identity as theists, people who believe in God, or even more specifically as people from Abrahamic religion. So they have a shared history, according to the teachings of each religion, to the biblical patriarch Abraham, right? Who is both the father of Isaac, who is the father of Jacob in turn, the ancestor to the Jewish people, and therefore indirectly the ancestor to Jesus and the Christian religion, and also the father to Ishmael, who is considered to be the ultimate ancestor of the Prophet Muhammad, of course brought Islam to the world. Anyway, so the idea here is you want to focus on these shared religious identities to try to accomplish a goal. And that could work as long as you're not erasing the individual identities in the process, right? If you're saying that, like, well, Muslim, Christian, whatever, it doesn't really matter, that tends to offend people. You need to focus on the idea that, like, yeah, these religions are still separate religions, but they do share a common set of values and they have a common history, Anyway, that's basically it for the lesson. There's also a ticket out the door that I had you guys do. It was a little rushed initially with the class, but you guys should make sure you take time to fill it out anyway. That's basically it. If you have questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you later.